Welcome back everyone to Vegetable Gardening for Master Gardeners. In this video we're going to discuss what kind of vegetables we can grow here in Hernando County and when we want to grow them. When you're growing vegetables here in Central Florida, timing is everything. Here we have vegetables that do very well here, but some are divided up into cool season vegetables and warm season vegetables. For any of you who maybe have moved down here from up north, the rules are very different here than they are in New Jersey or Michigan or wherever you may have moved from. So here in Central Florida, the time period from about the middle of June to the middle of August is too hot to grow very much. The only exceptions to that are okra, black-eyed peas, and if you planted sweet potatoes in the spring, they grow just fine during the heat of summer up into fall. Now, weather is going to be a major factor in success. We can't control or even really predict the weather very well year to year. So if we have an unusually warm winter, unusual late frost or freeze in the spring, very dry summer, very wet summer, that's going to throw things off a little bit. But as a general rule, we could divide everything into cool season crops and warm season crops. And if you follow the timing that's coming up, that'll get you most of the way towards being successful growing vegetables. So when I say warm season vegetables, those are the ones that you would plant in the spring or in the fall. So here, spring crops can go in technically anytime after February 20th, because that is our average last frost date here. But many years we'll get a surprise late season freeze or frost well after that. But as a general rule, these are vegetables that will not survive a freeze or a frost. You can start planting them from about March 1st on, and you want to plant them and plan on them being done and being ready to be pulled out of the ground by early June. Many of these warm season crops can be grown again in the fall when the days start to get a little shorter, starts to cool off a little bit, which is generally from August 15th or so on. So you can plant tomatoes, green beans, certain other crops again in the fall, and then hopefully they'll grow and they'll finish up before we get our first really serious cold weather in the winter. Now, on the other hand, cool season vegetables, you want to begin planting in early September. That's technically early fall, beginning of fall. A lot of these crops like weather that's a little bit cooler. So if you try planting, let's say, spinach, kale, radishes at the beginning of September, it may still be a little bit too warm for them then. You may have to wait until October or even a little bit later to put them in and have them do well. But our cool season vegetables you can plant all winter long, starting in early September or so, all the way up until March 1st. So these crops, you want to time them and plan on them being all done, harvested, and pulled up by March 1st, because after that point, cool season's over, it's starting to warm up, and it very quickly gets too hot for those cool season vegetables. So here you see a list of all of our warm season vegetables that could be grown right here in Hernando County, and we're going to go into each one of these a little bit more in depth, one by one. Beans include both bush beans and pole beans. Bush beans, when you plant them, the plant will get maybe 2 feet tall. Flowers, you get your crop of beans off of them, and then they're pretty much done. Pole beans grow much taller. They're a vining crop, and you have to grow them up on a sturdy trellis. They'll grow for longer. You tend to get more beans off of pole beans, but they take longer to mature to the point where they're flowering and giving you beans. If you look through seed catalogs now, you can find green beans, yellow beans, purple beans. This includes snap beans, the flat-potted Italian beans, lima beans, and many others. These you want to direct seed, which means you take those seeds, you plant them directly in the ground. You don't want to start transplants early. They get started directly in the garden. You can start them in really early to mid-March, all the way up until late March. And then again in August when you're doing your warm season crops again. Beans grow very well here. They do have one or two insect pests, a few diseases you might have to deal with, but as a general rule, if you plant a large patch of green beans, you're almost guaranteed to get some kind of decent harvest from them. Cucurbits are all the vegetable crops that are all in the family Cucurbidaceae. This includes cucumbers, all the different squash, everything from summer squash like zucchini and yellow squash and winter squash, any kind of melons, cantaloupes, honeydews, watermelons, pumpkins. Remember, pumpkins are really a winter squash, which means all these different crops have very similar pests and diseases. They can be very challenging. All these crops suffer from a number of different viruses that are vectored by whiteflies in Central Florida. They also suffer from a lot of fungal diseases. If you're trying to grow them during a time of year where it's very warm, wet, and humid, you're going to have a lot of disease problems. And it's difficult to get them in at the right time so that you actually get a harvest before the insects have their share and the diseases kill your plants. One of the hints to being able to grow cucumbers and summer squash is if you get the plants in very, very early in the spring. That way you can get your crop in, up and growing, and harvested before the really warm late spring weather sets in with the afternoon thunderstorms, high humidity, warm temperatures, and you're also going to beat a lot of the insects also. These technically can be planted again in the fall, but they're very, very difficult to grow then because if you think about it, the weather is still very warm, wet, humid. Insects are at their maximum populations at that point, and it's going to be really, really difficult to grow cucumbers or summer squash again in the fall. You can try, but like I said, generally the best steps to success is to get those crops in the spring and get them in very, very early. Corn obviously grows very well here in Central Florida. We still have Zellwood Corn and Corn Festival. We have a number of U-pick corn farms in our area. But corn can be very difficult for homeowners to grow. That's because it requires a large amount of space and also a lot of nitrogen fertilizer. Corn is also attacked by a number of different caterpillar species. Corn earworm, maybe when you're buying corn at the store, that's the reason why you peel back the tip to see if there's any caterpillars in it. They're very, very difficult for homeowners to control. Basically, if you're trying to grow corn at home, you end up having to literally soak it in pesticides to control those caterpillars. And there's several other insects that can really ruin a crop also. So even though it grows well here in Central Florida, it might not be the best choice for most small gardens and homeowners. Eggplants do very well in this area. And once again, if you look through seed catalogs, you'll find the traditional large, very, very dark purple or almost black eggplants, but there's a lot of new varieties are on the market. They come in white, light purple, lavender. You can grow long, skinny Asian eggplants. All of them do very well here in Central Florida. Eggplants are naturally a little bit more tropical of a plant, so it's one of the very few exceptions to the middle of the summer rule where almost nothing will grow. Eggplants, if you plant them in the spring, are going to last a little bit longer into summer. Every once in a while, you can actually keep your plants going through the summer. If you can control the diseases on them, the insects, keep them alive, when the weather cools off in the fall, they'll flush out with new growth, get new leaves on them, and start to come out with more flowers and more fruit. For about a 2-month period during the height of summer, the pollen in the flowers is going to be sterile whenever the average temperature is above 90, so you won't get any fruit for a few months during the summer. But if you can keep those plants alive, they'll be set and already large and full size for the fall when they'll flush out again and you might be able to get a second crop. Peppers, both sweet peppers and hot peppers, all varieties do very well here in Central Florida. This also makes a very good container pot. You want to grow them in at least a 5-gallon container or pot or bucket, but they do well in containers. If you look through seed catalogs, you see there's just a huge variety of different shapes, colors, sizes, different heat levels available also. You can grow hot peppers that are just a little bit hot all the way up to scorching hot for anybody that really likes that. Now peppers, you want to start from transplants, which means you're going to plant the little seeds in small containers, either indoors in a greenhouse, a shade house, a hoop house, very early, generally around early January. You need to keep the seeds warm until they sprout, but then after that you can put them out during the day when it's sunny and warm in the late winter, early spring. But when it gets cold at night, you want to bring them inside and keep them warm. That way you have good sized plants that are all ready to be put in the garden at the appropriate time, which would be early to mid-March. Now peppers, once again, like eggplants, if you plant them in the spring, and if you're able to keep them alive during the summer, and there's no guarantee of that, then what happens in the fall is when the days start to get a little bit shorter, temperatures start to drop a little bit, they'll flush out, they'll grow again, and you'll get a whole second crop of peppers. So that might be something worth trying. Sweet potatoes are a crop you don't see very often in people's gardens, but they do very well here in Central Florida. They're very easy to grow. You want to plant the plants in the very early spring and then just let them go. Let them grow all summer long. And then in the fall, when the plants start to die back a little bit, you could feel around the base of the plants and you'll find your sweet potato roots underground. You start harvesting them. Sweet potatoes have one or two problems. There is a sweet potato weevil that can be a problem. You want to allow plenty of room for the vines because once they take off, they really spread. You want to dedicate a whole section of your garden to nothing but sweet potatoes. How you start sweet potatoes, you could do the old-fashioned way and buy some sweet potatoes at the store, put them in a glass of water with one end in the water, and they'll sprout. If you cut off each one of those sprouts and put it in the ground, it'll grow. Or if you look through seed catalogs, there's about 5 or 10 different varieties of sweet potatoes, and you can pick the variety that you want to grow and order the little baby plants, they call them slips, from the catalog and put them in. Generally, if you put them in a patch all by themselves, you harvest them in the fall, it's really difficult to get all of them. You're probably going to leave a couple little plants or roots behind. They're going to freeze and die back during the winter, but if you leave them alone, they're going to sprout again and come back in the spring. So if you plant a sweet potato patch once, you can have the plants keep coming back every spring and then get another crop for free for a couple years. After a couple years, you're going to want to rotate your patches. So you want to plant something else in that area for a season or two. You don't want to grow sweet potatoes year after year after year in the exact same spot. But if you just leave a few little roots and a few little slips behind in the fall, when you're harvesting, you can grow another patch for free the next spring. Tomatoes are still the most popular homegrown vegetable. There's a lot of different types. There's cherry tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, or pear or plum tomatoes, and beefsteak tomatoes, which are anywhere from medium to very large slicing tomatoes. The problem here in Central Florida is we can grow them in the spring and you can grow them again in the fall, but our season for being able to grow tomatoes when the weather is right, not too hot, not too cold, is technically reasonably short. So people who want to grow heirloom tomatoes, beefsteak tomatoes, the really large ones that take a very long time to grow, they usually don't do very well in this area because they take too long to grow. I've always found that if you grow cherry tomatoes or Roma tomatoes, they generally come up fast. If you grow a number of cherry tomato plants and only half of them survive, when they get large, you'll start getting a lot of cherry tomatoes off of them. Roma tomatoes are determinate tomatoes, which means you plant the seeds, you raise the transplants, put them in your garden. They're going to grow to maybe 3 feet tall, flower a lot, and get one really, really big crop of tomatoes. Now, it'll keep flowering and getting more tomatoes for a bit longer after that, but not for a very long time. So Romas, you tend to get one big flush of flowers and one big flush of fruit all at once. That's what makes them so nice for canning, freezing, using in recipes and putting them up, is because you get them all at the same time. So the most successful varieties that are going to do well here in Central Florida are varieties that you can put in early, very fast maturing ones that take very comparatively few days to grow and mature, and anything that has any kind of genetic disease resistance. Many times if you're looking at tomato seeds in the store, they'll have names like big boy, big girl, early girl, and then right next to that they'll have letters, maybe a V, an F, an N. V means that it's resistant to verticillium wilt. F means it's resistant to fusarium. N means it has resistance to nematodes, if you remember the section on nematodes. So any varieties you can find with the more letters next to the name, generally the better. The more resistance you can get naturally in those tomatoes, the more successful you're going to be. Here we have a list of all the different cool season vegetable crops that we can grow from fall all the way through winter up until very early spring here. So let's go through each one of these one by one for a little bit more in depth on each one. All the different brassica or cruciferous crops are all in the same family, and they include broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, mustards, Brussels sprouts, and a few others. So because they're all very closely related, they're all going to share the same pests and diseases. The nice thing about growing things in the winter is, as a general rule, you're going to have far fewer insect and disease problems. You'll still have some. Different brassica crops suffer from caterpillars during the winter, a couple fungal diseases, but nothing nearly as bad as during the spring or the fall, or definitely not as bad as over summer. So these crops can all be grown all winter long, but you need to put the last planting in, kind of counting back on the calendar and aiming to have them done in March, maybe by middle of March at the very latest, because anything past this and these crops are all going to start to look really bad. They're going to have a lot more insect problems, a lot more disease problems, and they're not going to taste very good either. So you want to definitely grow these during the winter, during the cool season. Onions can do well in this area. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Florida sweet onions. They're grown right here in Central Florida. So this includes green onions or scallions, onion sets, which are little partly grown onion bulbs that you could buy at feed stores and hardware stores in the spring. Plant in the ground and they'll grow. They'll grow a little bit bigger, but not a whole lot bigger than the original onion set. And you can grow large onions here also. If you want to try growing large onions to grow Vidalia type onions, you want to pick some type of Texas Grano variety seeds. Many times these will have names like Texas Grano 123 or Texas Grano 789, Texas Grano and some kind of number next to it. All of them do well here. You need to plant the seeds for those in the middle of August, and what you're going to end up with is little teeny tiny baby onion seedlings. Transplant those into your garden within maybe a month. So middle of September, they'll go in your garden and just leave them alone. They're going to grow all winter long. And then when the days start to get a little bit longer in the spring and the weather warms up, the longer days will trigger those onions to grow faster and start to form the bulbs. And you can grow actual large Vidalia type onions here. The reason why Vidalia onions are so famous and so sweet and so good, they're all grown in a certain section of Georgia where the soil is naturally very low in sulfur, because it's sulfur levels in the soil that make onions hot. Florida doesn't have really unusually high sulfur levels normally in the soil, so growing these here, they might not be quite as sweet as the Vidalia onions are, but they're pretty close, and great way for you to grow your own large onions. You pick them in the early spring, usually around April when they look full size. Just brush off the dirt, let them sit outside for a day or two if it's dry, if it's not humid or rainy, to dry off really well, and then you can have them for a couple months after that. Leafy crops include any kind of different lettuces, chard, spinach, kale, mustard greens, turnip greens, collard greens. All the different green leafy crops can be grown all winter long here in Central Florida. Many of them are very fast maturing crops also. Some types of lettuce take maybe 1 to 2 months to mature. Romaine might take a little bit longer. Kale comes up and grows very fast. Spinach grows very fast also. They're all very fast and easy to grow, also very nutritious too. And if you look through seed catalogs, you can find red leaf lettuce, green leaf lettuce, different colored romaines. The one lettuce crop that does not do well here is traditional iceberg lettuce. It never really sizes up and forms a head like what you buy at the store. But most every other variety of lettuce will do very, very well here. Now, what you could do instead of planting your whole garden in lettuce, which means in a month or two it's all going to be ready and needs to be picked all at the same time, you could plant just a couple rows or a little area in lettuce today, and then in 2 weeks plant a little bit more, couple weeks plant a little bit more, and that way all winter long it'll mature in succession and you'll have fresh lettuce all winter long. Now, some of these crops, kale and spinach, really do not like warm weather. So if we're having a very warm winter, they're going to struggle. And you probably don't want to start them too early in September or maybe not even October. But once we get a little bit cooler into, let's say, November, December, January, kale and spinach both do very, very well here and grow very quickly. Different root crops, carrots, radishes, beets, all do very well here during the winter. They generally grow pretty quickly also, so you can succession plant those. That way you have carrots all winter long instead of just one big harvest. Same with radishes. Radishes are about the easiest vegetable there is to grow. Most varieties take about 30 days from planting the seed to picking the radish. Beets do very well here. A lot of people enjoy the beet greens, and you can also grow it for the beet roots. If you look through seed catalogs, you're going to see that there's a wide variety of different types and selections out there on the market now. Even with just carrots, you can get, very long carrots, short carrots, round carrots, yellow ones, purple ones, different colors. So there's quite a bit of variety, not just the traditional large orange grocery store type carrots. So definitely experiment with different varieties. What I would always do is I'd try different varieties, usually the newest ones that they would come out with every year. I'd try growing those, and either they do really, really well, and you want to mark down the name and keep ordering the seeds and plant them again in the future, or they're not going to do very well here just because of our weather. They might not have very good disease resistance. They might be especially attractive to an insect pest, and that way you know not to try growing that variety again. But don't be afraid to experiment. Generally, these crops are all very pest and disease free. Radishes and beets, you'll have maybe caterpillars or flea beetles feed on the leaves a little bit, but many times not to the point where they're really damaging or decreasing the growth of the root. So they're very pest and disease free to grow. And regular potatoes can be grown here in Florida too. Keep in mind over on the east side of the state, over around St. Augustine, areas around there, they grow a lot of potatoes over there during the winter. Now, regular potatoes get planted at a kind of unusual time of year. You want to put those in the ground in January or February. You could look through seed catalogs and order the seed potatoes from there, or sometimes lawn and garden stores or feed stores will have potatoes also that you could buy and cut out the eyes and plant those and grow your own potatoes at home also. Peas are another crop that you can grow all winter long. This includes the traditional green peas that you grow, you pick the pods, you have to shell the pods and get the peas out of them, or the flat potted snow peas or the round potted snap peas, both of which you eat the entire thing, pod and all. All of them do very well here. All of them are vining plants, so you're going to need to grow them on a trellis, and you need to make it a very strong, sturdy trellis, because these plants, if you plant a lot of them, can get very large and very heavy and do very well. Good thing is you're going to get a lot of peas off of them. The bad thing is if your trellis is not very sturdy or a little flimsy, if we get, a breeze or an afternoon thunderstorm, it might fall over. So like I said, these are very easy to grow. During most winters, they can be very heavy producers also. The peas, the actual little pods, are sensitive to freezing temperatures. So if we're going to have a serious freeze, you want to go out there and pick all the peas off the plant. But the plants will survive a freeze, and within a few days, they'll start to grow back, they'll start to flower again, and you'll start to get continued production of those peas. So a little bit about controlling pests on vegetable crops. I didn't want to get into too many different specifics about which caterpillars or pests affect exactly which crops. Just a little bit of an overview of how you would go about controlling pests in a vegetable garden. Some of the big picture ideas that you've heard in previous presentations on integrated pest management is proper pest identification is the most important first step. You can't control and you can't treat what you don't understand if you have or not. So actually finding the pest and identifying it, or taking a close look at the leaf and identifying if it's a disease and what type of disease, is the first step. So of course you want to follow a program of integrated pest management in a vegetable garden. Scout frequently. This doesn't take a lot of time. It just takes diligence. Go out there every day or every other day at most and look through your vegetable garden, kind of feel around through the plants, look for anything out of the ordinary. Are there any chewed leaves? Are there any spotted leaves? Is there anything wrong in the garden? Because with any kind of pest, the earlier you catch it, the easier it is to control. And keep in mind, I think I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating, that there's no silver bullets. If you're speaking with somebody who has a vegetable garden, they want to know that one magic spray they can buy at the store, that if they use it, it's going to solve all the problems. It does not exist. You have to start with identification and then take it through step by step, figure out what you have, look through University of Florida information to find the best way to manage it or deal with it, and then, take action if you need to, if it's to the point where you have to take action, and then follow up and figure out if you were successful or not. And now a little bit on controlling plant diseases in the garden. The best way to control diseases in a vegetable garden is by using cultural controls. As I mentioned earlier in part one of this two-part series on growing vegetables, irrigation is very important. Ideally, you're going to be using drip irrigation, which helps keep the leaves dry, which is going to help protect them from fungal diseases. If you're not using drip irrigation, you're using overhead irrigation. You want to do that early in the morning, so when the sun comes up, it'll dry the leaves off. Very important. You don't want to put your garden to bed wet overnight, because then you're going to be really encouraging different fungal diseases. Sanitation is very important. The picture on the previous slide, that was of a diseased broccoli leaf that has a fungal problem. Keep in mind, each one of those leaves, once it becomes spotted and falls off the plant, is now covered with fungal spores. So rain splash is going to blast those spores back up onto your healthy leaves. The wind will blow those fungal spores back up onto your healthy leaves. So sanitation is important in the vegetable garden. If you have diseased leaves, a dead diseased plant, you want to pull them out and dispose of them very quickly to help slow down the spread of that disease. Genetic resistance, I mentioned earlier about picking seeds that have little letters next to the name, or when you turn the packet over, you're reading the information. It may say that resistant to this, resistant to powdery mildew, resistant to downy mildew. Every little bit of resistance you get helps. And then, of course, proper planting time really helps you to avoid a lot of insect pests and diseases, because if you plant at the wrong time, your plants are going to start to have much greater and much worse fungal disease problems, especially if you plant things too late or try to grow them over and too deep into summer. You're going to find that your vegetable garden is going to go downhill very, very quickly from diseases once we get to the time of year where it's very humid, very rainy, and very wet on a regular basis, especially at night. So once again, you want to scout frequently, learn a little bit about the different signs and symptoms, we've already covered that, of different common diseases, and then learn when to treat with fungicides. Remember, fungicides only work as a preventative. So if you have a plant or if you have a leaf that has leaf spots, it has a fungal problem, spraying it with a fungicide is not going to fix the leaf. It's not going to turn it green and healthy again. What a fungicide does do is help protect the other leaves that are not affected yet, and especially the brand new growth that's just starting to come out. It will help to protect that so that it doesn't start to get the fungus problem. So you want to use a fungicide as a preventative and generally as the last step. You want to take every precaution and every step you can leading up to that to try to avoid or at least limit fungal diseases. And I believe that's all we have on growing vegetables for Master Gardeners. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Just you can ask me, write down your question, ask me in class, because if you're wondering about it or you have the question, chances are a number of other people do too. Thank you.